Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
How much do you really know about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? The Constitution. How often do you think about it? Probably not that much. Why would you? You can't see it or feel it, but it's there. It's always there. Protecting your rights under the law. You get up, you go to work, you live your life freely, because the Charter exists to stop the government infringing on your rights. Life, liberty, and security of the person. To all Canadians, those rights are guaranteed. And we take that for granted, because they are guaranteed. At least, until they're not. This week, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre made a campaign announcement that has reignited debate about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 33, also known as the Notwithstanding Clause. I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, what is the Notwithstanding Clause in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And why is Pierre Poilievre promising to use it if he becomes Prime Minister? I'm joined today by Eric Adams, an expert on constitutional law and professor at the University of Alberta. Hi, Professor Adams. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, really pleased to be here.
First off, what does the Notwithstanding Clause in the Charter allow a government to do?
You'd be surprised how often I get asked this at dinner parties, especially in the last couple of years. And it makes me feel good that I know something that is finally useful at the dinner table. So let me talk about it this way. The Notwithstanding Clause, and it surprises some people that this is the case, the Notwithstanding Clause effectively allows both the Parliament of Canada and any provincial legislature to attach a kind of mini charter shield around a law that they enact. And that mini charter shield, that use of the Notwithstanding Clause, will mean that that particular law cannot be struck down even if it violates several of the important sections of the Charter.
Yeah, so if a court rules that a law the government has passed is unconstitutional, they can apply Section 33 to it, and for a period of 5 years, it can be enacted, even though the judge has ruled it was unconstitutional, right?
Exactly right.
Okay. Why was it included in the Charter in the first place? The framers of the Constitution, why did they put this in there?
It's a question that has also flummoxed people. Brian Mulroney once said, the Notwithstanding Clause made the Charter not worth the paper it was printed on. Why is it there? It's there because in 1981, when the Charter was being debated, negotiated, and it was a dream of Pierre Trudeau to have this constitutional amendment. A handful of provinces and the premiers were on board, but most were opposed. Most provinces, there were 8 of them, the Gang of 8 they called them, said, this is a bad idea for our constitution. We don't want to give up what was called parliamentary supremacy. Why would we hand over ultimate decisions about whether a law should live or die or not to courts? That decision should rest in the hands of legislatures. It should rest in the hands of voters. Why would we want to give courts more power in striking down democratically enacted laws? Oh, and by the way, Canada's had, at that point, 120 years of constitutional history in which our defining feature has been that parliaments and legislatures are ultimately the ones in charge. At the end of the day, they get to decide what content of law there should be. And if the public doesn't like it, they vote in a new legislature, and that is what will change the law. So when the Charter was being negotiated, a number of premiers were pushing for, if we were going to have a Charter, and they were opposed to it, but if we were going to have it, then it should have this ability of legislatures and parliament to have what they called the final word. And they were thinking in particular of, what if a court gets it just totally wrong? What if they strike down some piece of legislation that, we think it's just crazy that they've taken that step. We want some democratic way of responding. And when the charter was hanging in the balance and when it looked like they weren't going to get a deal late in the night in the middle of November, a couple of officials, Jean Chrétien was one of them, hammered out this compromise package that included the Notwithstanding Clause. They took it to Trudeau. He hated the idea, but he knew that the only way to get this charter with enough provincial consent was to say yes to a Notwithstanding Clause, and that was the deal they got.
Sort of a check on the power of the judiciary. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the prime minister at the time, said, quote, "It is a way that the legislatures, federal and provincial, have of ensuring that the last word is held by the elected representatives of the people rather than by the courts," end quote. But this concept is kind of uniquely Canadian, as I understand it. Do other constitutional democracies have a notwithstanding clause like the one in the Canadian Charter?
No, this is our constitutional maple syrup. It's a unique feature of Canada, and it arose, I think, because of this unique dynamic where the Bill of Rights was being negotiated by, between premiers and the federal government in a really tense, fraught set of negotiations, number one. Number two, it was also, pulling Canada between its two constitutional traditions. On the one hand, it had always been thought of as having a constitution similar in principle to the United Kingdom, and in the British system, there is no rights that can check Parliament. Parliament has the ultimate sovereignty, and of course, the United States of America, which had this longstanding entrenched rights tradition and more focus on the power of courts to strike down legislation. Canada, in some ways, combines both those traditions by having a Charter of Rights that gives judges that power, but also includes a Notwithstanding Clause, which allows the legislature and parliament to retain some aspect of their ultimate supremacy.
Okay, so it's a tool that is in the Constitution. Nonetheless, it's safe to say that actually using the Notwithstanding Clause is controversial for any government. Most provinces have never used it, with the exception of Quebec, which has its own unique circumstance that we don't have time to get into on this episode. Maybe we can have you back someday just to talk about Quebec. But setting aside Quebec, Section 33 has been invoked by provinces sparingly since it was drafted. Some well-known examples: it was used in Saskatchewan in the 1980s to settle a strike. It was used in Alberta in the year 2000. The government of the day wanted to get ahead of gay marriage being legalized at the federal level and block certain spousal privileges for same-sex couples. That use was eventually struck down. It's been used 3 times controversially by the Ford government in Ontario. First, when they remade the Toronto City Council wards in 2018, again in 2021 to change election advertising laws, and most recently in 2022 to mandate striking education workers back to work, although the government did eventually repeal its own bill in that case after considerable backlash. So outside of Quebec, Section 33 has been invoked a handful of times in all of its years of existence. Why do provinces use it so sparingly?
I think there are a couple of answers to that. And one is when you go back to those 1981 negotiations and when the charter came into law in 1982, it was a pretty broad view that the Notwithstanding Clause was going to sit on the shelf and gather dust, in part because the charter was immensely popular politically. It remains that way today. And the thought was that, look, the political cost to any government to break that glass, use the Notwithstanding Clause, it was going to encounter such intense political opposition that a government would really need to be on very sure footing if it was ever going to take that road. And it was basically thought of as a bit radioactive politically. And so even though you're right that I think there's basically been a tradition where it is not seen heavy constitutional use, we've seen an uptick in recent uses and threatened uses. And it's possible that we are headed into a new constitutional moment when some worry that its uses may in fact becoming normalized. And I think, again, it's just a sense that the further we get away from that 1981 moment when that consensus was built that, look, the political costs of this are simply too high, and we live in a world in which maybe the political costs aren't that high, depending on the rationale for its use. I mean, certainly Saskatchewan, I think, would say they have the public behind them in using the Notwithstanding Clause in their recent handful of uses, and that's always been one of the arguments of Quebec. Look, the use when we use the Notwithstanding Clause, it's popular. So, are we in a new era where rights infringements have more the potential for political popularity? I certainly think that's possible. It's also possible that it remains as it has been for the last 40 years, which is a sparingly used tool that gets trotted out in very particular circumstances.
I want to talk specifically about Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, because this is why this debate has been reignited, why it's back in the news this week. Pierre Poilievre has now promised to use the Notwithstanding Clause to implement criminal justice reforms if he becomes prime minister. So this week he announced he would bring back consecutive life sentences for people convicted of murder so that they would have no chance of parole for more than 50 years. In Canada, a life sentence is 25 years. So after 25 years, a convicted murderer would be eligible for parole. But if you stack a second life sentence on top of that, it stretches the window to 50 years, so on and so forth. I'd like to ask you if you can explain for our listeners, why does he need to use the Notwithstanding Clause to do that?
Because the previous law that allowed for stacking of sentences, as you say, was struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada as unconstitutional a handful of years ago, in a case in which the court said that basically condemning someone to death in prison constituted cruel and unusual punishment under Section 12 of the Charter. Now, I think it's important for listeners to know that if someone is eligible for parole, it does not mean that they get out on parole or receive parole. And we've got a history in Canada of denying parole to people who have committed, multiple murders. So, the court, I think, was of the view that let the parole system continue to detain people where there is reason to do so. But just in theory, you could not deny individuals the idea that there might be some possibility of reform to themselves. And so that's the law. And if Mr. Poilievre is going to return to punishing people so that there is no possibility of parole, he's going to need to use the Notwithstanding Clause to do so.
Right. Okay. So if this comes to pass, and again, it's a big if, but in theory, the federal government using the Notwithstanding Clause, it's never been done before. The Notwithstanding Clause says the federal government can use it, but thus far in history, it's only been used by the provinces. If this happens, there will inevitably be pushback. What are some of the concerns that you would expect to be raised by the legal community if this comes to pass?
Well, I think there are a number. One of the, I think, concerns is that, especially in the domain of criminal law, that's a constituency that is a kind of classic minority without much of a political champion. It's hard to stand up and say that, a handful of politicians do so, but it's hard to stand up and say that people who've committed horrendous crimes, deserve the benefit of the doubt. Most of us, most of the time, think that people who've committed crimes probably need to get punished. It's there's a kind of human nature element there. And so if you break the glass on the notwithstanding clause at the federal level, and if Parliament begins to use it in the criminal justice world, it means that the checks that courts place on criminal law to make sure that the rights of this very unpopular constituency in Canadian society are protected. The right to innocence, the right to bail, the right to have a fair hearing. Those issues, of course, matter in the rule of law and in having a fair criminal justice system. And if they can be overridden by the notwithstanding clause, then we might see some very serious erosion of some of the safeguards that have long been important in our criminal justice system. Because even though you think, the criminals should pay the price, when it turns around and you're the person in the glare of the criminal justice system, you're going to want those procedural protections. The public may not be behind you, but you're going to want the rights that are guaranteed in the charter to be making sure that you're afforded the due process that you're entitled to.
Right. It's kind of a slippery slope argument because we have separation of powers in Canadian democracy. You have the judicial branch and the executive branch, which is the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and the legislative branch, which is Parliament. So the concern then, I think, would be from the legal community is if Parliament makes a habit of using the notwithstanding clause to undo rulings about constitutionality, where does it go? Because this particular circumstance, I think many people would agree, may be politically popular. It's hard to argue politically against punishing a murderer. But at the same time, if you establish a precedent, if it becomes normalized that the government can ignore court rulings on constitutionality of various pieces of legislation, that gets to the heart of those separation of powers in democracy.
And you have to remember that, despite I think the good faith of parliaments and legislatures to do their work over Canadian history, we know that there have been times in our history when those institutions have abused the rights of vulnerable minorities. And they didn't think they were doing wrong at the time, but they did so. And you think about the treatment of Japanese Canadians through the Second World War. You think about the treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses and the harassment that they suffered in law and in the treatment of various kinds of officials. And you just know that, that our legal system is important to be able to stand up against rights infringements that come from the democratic arena. And the tyranny of the majority is a real threat to the capacity of vulnerable peoples to have a life full of dignity and rights. And that's why we have a legal system. We have evolved this precious institution to say that democracy is about more than just about majority and majoritarian preferences. It's also about making sure that minority interests are protected in our rule of law. And that's the concern about a world in which the notwithstanding clause is running rampant. Do we lose some of that necessary protection?
Very interesting. Thank you for that. And just finally today, if a federal government, any future federal government, were to take a look at this, because as we've discussed, there's been this trend of more frequent use of the notwithstanding clause. If it is invoked, the notwithstanding clause, are there any checks on the use of Section 33? Can it be challenged? Can it be overturned?
Let me just remind listeners that it has built-in checks to it, so it can't be used against every provision of the charter. It's only Section 2 and Section 7 to 15. Now, those are serious rights, your fundamental freedoms, your legal rights, rights to equality, but a government can't use it, for example, to deny the right to vote. A government could never use the Notwithstanding Clause to create a dictatorship, or to get out of the division of powers, or to get out of Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution. The second important limit is that the Notwithstanding Clause only lasts for 5 years. It has what's called a sunset clause. So as soon as you invoke it, the clock starts ticking, and it will set. And if it's not renewed, then the use of the Notwithstanding Clause will end, and the law is now subject to the normal constitutional oversight. Of course, it's also true that governments, legislatures can renew the Notwithstanding Clause again and again and again and again. But at least with that sunset clause, it keeps it as a democratic issue that will always be debated, and that the media will continue to have scrutiny over those uses. So there are checks within the use of the Notwithstanding Clause internally, but the Supreme Court of Canada has said, as long as you follow the bare outlines of how to invoke it, that is, you have to expressly declare in a law that you're using the Notwithstanding Clause and identify the provisions of the charter that you are overriding. Other than that, there's not much for the courts to do of unwinding the use of a legislature's Notwithstanding Clause.
Okay, fascinating. Professor Adams, thank you so much for your time today. It's a debate that will continue to be a fixture, I think, in politics at provincial and the federal level moving forward, especially through this election campaign. I thank you so much for joining us to explain for our listeners exactly what is so controversial about it. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
And again, that is Professor Eric Adams, expert in constitutional law and professor at the University of Alberta. And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. Until next time, I'm David Smith. Thank you for listening.